Right now, we're getting a first look at the state of homelessness in the city. Members from the Coalition for the Homeless are in Lower Manhattan discussing their 2019 report and analysis of the city. Let's listen in.
It is for this reason that the Coalition for the Homeless gives Mayor de Blasio a failing grade. State of the Homeless gives the mayor an F in housing, supply, and production. By failing to align his affordable housing plan with the realities of mass homelessness in New York City, the mayor is squandering a unique opportunity to finally turn things around, to finally reduce the shelter census, to finally turn the tide, if you will. That's just one of the findings in this report. And I'd now like to bring up the report's principal author, Giselle Ruthier, the Coalition's policy director, who will walk you through the other findings and the explanations of how failures by both the mayor and the governor are effectively perpetuating the city's homelessness crisis. Thank you. Giselle?
Thanks everybody for coming. I have my Veep podium here. All right, so I'm gonna run through a lot of the data findings in the report and some of our main charts. Happy to answer questions during the presentation or after, and we'll get going. So as Dave said, we are currently experiencing unrelenting record homelessness, which continues to persist under this administration, under Mayor de Blasio and under Governor Cuomo. One of the main findings here that is so stark is that in 2017, when the mayor released his Turning the Tide plan, we were critical because he projected just a minimal decrease in the shelter census of 2,500 people over the next 5 years. And here we are a year later, and we're actually on track for the shelter census to increase by 5,000 people in that same time period. And the main problem is the lack of affordable housing. So both the city and state governments bear responsibility for this crisis, and we're going to go through bit by bit all of the things that they're responsible for. So our top line recommendation for the mayor is that he follow the House Our Future campaign, which is a campaign that we've led and have been running for the past year, to build from the ground up, new construction, 24,000 units of new, deeply subsidized affordable housing for homeless New Yorkers as part of his Housing New York 2.0 plan. That works out to be about 20% of all new construction in the plan. And we want him to preserve at least 6,000 more for a total of 30,000 units. It's critical to note that we're heavy on new construction here because preservation units are already occupied. And what we want to do here, and what's so critical, is for us to actually expand the supply of available affordable housing for people to be able to move into immediately. And so creating new units is what's going to do that. For Governor Cuomo, our top line item is that he implement home stability support, which is a statewide rental supplement program. That's introduced by Assemblymember Andrew Hevesi and Senator Liz Krueger. This was not included in the state budget, but we want him to continue, we want it to be passed legislatively, and it would allow folks in New York City to have a much more robust rental assistance program to be able to use to find housing both for people who are currently homeless and at risk of homelessness. So here's just a visual of what would happen if our recommendations are implemented. So I'll point you to the red line first, which is where the mayor predicted we would be in 2022, starting in 27. And the green line shows the track that we're currently on. The purple line is our recommendations. So if the mayor implements our recommendations to actually build more housing and expand the supply of affordable housing, we could actually see a meaningful reduction in homelessness for the first time since 2013. So just a quick overview of our homeless policy report card, which is in the report, and I'll go through some of these really quickly. Top line items, the mayor gets a failing grade for housing production. The governor gets 3 failing grades in a variety of different ways, which I'll describe. So for housing production and supply on the city side, it's really important to note that between the beginning of Housing New York 2.0 and June 2018, just 1,700 households moved out of homeless shelters into HPD-financed apartments during that entire time. And that's an extraordinarily low number. And as you can see, the city's 2 principal housing agencies, the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, and HPD, collectively placed only 62 more homeless households into permanent housing between 2017 and 2018, which is dismally insufficient compared to the growing crisis. As you'll see also, the blue line represents the number of folks that have moved out of shelters or been prevented from entering shelters through with the help of the DSS-initiated rental assistance programs. So this is important in that the city that's tasked primarily with implementing public benefits is bearing the brunt of helping people move out into housing. But as you'll see, and we'll talk about a little bit later, it's increasingly into more unstable placements as the stock of housing that's available for people with vouchers is insufficient. So this is a description of what we're asking for in our House Our Future plan for the new construction ask. So this total line is what the mayor plans to do through his Housing New York 2.0 plan in terms of new construction. He's proposed building 120,000 new units through 2026. And we're asking for just 20% of that. We want 24,000 units. That's going to mean that the city is going to have to build roughly 2,700 new units each year between now and the end of the program to actually make a meaningful difference in homelessness. So for housing vouchers and stability, the city gets a B-, the state gets an F. The city gets a B- because they've been able to maintain the levels of folks moving out of shelters with the help of city-initiated rental subsidies, including LINK, CityFEPs, and SEPs. But as you'll see in 2018, the increase there is largely the result of an increased reliance on a program called SODA, also known as Special One-Time Assistance. And this is a program that only provides 1 year's of rental assistance and also has been in the news for moving people into unsafe housing out of state and provides a lot less stability in terms of folks moving out of shelter. So the city's really struggling now to actually find apartments within these rent levels and continue to be able to move people out, and we're seeing an increased reliance on more unstable placements. There's another graph in the report as well that lays out the increased reliance on rooms, particularly for single adults. Rather than moving into their own studio apartments or one-bedroom apartments, they're increasingly have to relying on roommate situations, which are less stable and oftentimes results in a return to shelter. The state gets an F for housing vouchers because they did not implement home stability support, and they also continue to contribute just a meager amount to the existing city-initiated rental subsidies. So just 14% of the existing suite of rental subsidies that we have in the city right now, just 14% is being funded by the state currently, and the majority is being funded by the city. For supportive housing is something that's really critical as well. Both the city and state get a C here because there's been some progress, but not enough. In fiscal year 2018, you'll see that the number of single adults who moved into supportive housing, which is permanent affordable housing with support services attached, and this is housing specifically for people with severe mental illness, substance use issues, and who need a deeper level of support. But that number reached the lowest it has been in 14 years, even as the number of single adults has skyrocketed. This is something that needs to be addressed immediately. We talk about in our recommendations the need for both the city and state to accelerate their pipeline of supportive housing. Both the city and state have dual commitments, and so they need to bring those up much more quickly than they are currently, because this is contributing significantly to the rise in single adult homelessness. For homeless prevention, the city gets an A-, the state gets an F again. For homeless prevention, we've seen actually some level of promising data here where residential evictions have reached an all-time low since we have data going back to 2006. And for the first time, decreased below 20,000, and this is in large part due to prevention efforts that have been implemented by the city, including right to counsel, so more low-income tenants have access to legal counsel, and housing court, which is critical, increases in rental assistance grants. This is really important for reducing eviction as a predictor of homelessness. But at the same time, the state has not helped the situation. One of the main ways the state continues to contribute to record homelessness in New York City is by directly releasing people from state prisons directly to the shelter system. And as you'll see, from 2014 to 2018, the numbers here have really skyrocketed. Both in 2017 and 2018, over half of all individuals who were released from state prisons were released directly to the shelter system, contributing to the steep and sustained increase that we have in single adult homelessness in New York City. And this is entirely the state's fault for not doing adequate discharge planning, identifying other housing options, vetting housing options that might be available to people who are leaving prison, and this is contributing significantly to where we are. We talk a little bit about meeting the unprecedented need for shelters. So although our top line item is permanent housing, we know that people who are in crisis need access to shelter immediately. Here the city gets a C+, and the state again gets an F. And the reason the state gets an F is between 2011 and 2018, as the shelter census continued to grow and we see more folks entering the shelter system, the city shouldered 92% of the increased shelter costs not covered by the federal government, as the state continued to systematically shift its responsibilities to pay for shelter onto the city, both for families and for single adults. And the city, while they have increased capacity and there are plans to add more shelters to meet that capacity, they are still operating in some months with a very, very low vacancy rate and making it very tight and difficult for people to access shelter. This is one example of what happens when the shelter vacancy rate gets too low. We see the use of what are called pass beds, which are unlawful under Callahan. And what they are is when the city, it's a practice of the city assigning someone who comes in, a new person who comes in, into a bed that's already occupied by someone, but they're out working that night. So they're essentially double bunking someone in someone else's bed. It causes a lot of other problems besides the fact that that person doesn't get a stable bed. And you see in the months where we had really tight numbers, particularly in October and November, the use of those beds increases. And that's a practice that we've seen over many years, that when the shelter census gets tight, practices that are unlawful and that are unhelpful for individuals in the shelter system tend to get worse, and we see the shelter system getting more chaotic. There's more information also on that slide in your report about how the city has increased some capacity, so you can refer to those charts as well. For family intake and eligibility, both the city and state are not doing well here. We have the eligibility rate for families with children that's the lowest in 6 years at about 40%, and the lowest in 8 years for adult families. So this means when families are coming in to the front door of the shelter system, they have to experience or go through a very onerous application process where they have to provide a 2-year housing history, document every place they've slept in the past 2 years. If they miss 1 week, or identify a housing option that's completely unsafe for them, where they left or had to flee, the city may say, oh no, you're not eligible for shelter, and thus the family is stuck, forced to reapply. There's another chart where we show the percentage of families that had to submit applications more than once in order to ultimately be found eligible, really sort of highlighting this error-prone process. And this adds to the stress that families are already experiencing when they're entering the shelter system, and this is unacceptable in our view, as we see families in our office every single day struggling with how to access an emergency resource that they need so desperately. We can talk a little bit about shelter conditions, because the Coalition for the Homeless has a unique role as the independent monitor, court-appointed monitor of the single adult shelter system and the city-appointed monitor of the family shelter system. So we've done a lot of work over the past year, including over 150 unscheduled visits to shelters around the city, joint inspections of single adult shelters and family shelters. And the 3 common issues that we encounter are large-scale capital needs, so roofs falling apart, heating needing to be fixed, elevators not working. Routine cleaning and maintenance is a huge issue on nights and weekends. We see bathrooms in filthy conditions, particularly during the night, particularly over the weekends, where residents sometimes try to resort to cleaning themselves without the proper supplies, and continuing complaints by dehumanizing treatment by staff. And all of this sort of goes to say that the conditions and the culture within the shelter system is still problematic and still needs a lot of work in order to become more humane and responsive to people's needs. And lastly, about homeless children and students, we give the city a C- because there hasn't been a whole lot of progress in terms of the data that we see with homeless students. On average, homeless students miss still 32 days of school on a school year, and that's more than the average that a child can miss without being held back. And so we see that homeless students continue to struggle, and this is particularly relevant during the eligibility process, as I mentioned before, when families are trying to prove that they're eligible for shelter, prove that they're homeless. Kids are missing school a lot during that process. As you'll see in this particular graph, less than half of homeless families were placed in a shelter near the school of their youngest child, and so that continues to be an issue that one thing the city plans to address with their shelter plan is to allow for capacities such that families can be placed near existing social supports. That's really critical for the impact of homelessness on children. And one other really staggering stat, as of 2017, we know that 1 out of every 100 babies born in New York City was born to a mom in a shelter. And that's just really staggering, and something that we've wanted to highlight. We have a whole slew of recommendations. I'm not going to read all of these. They're on the last pages of your report and also in the executive summary. I'll just highlight a few top line items. As we said, the top line item for Mayor de Blasio is to follow the House Our Future campaign to build 24,000 new units and preserve at least 6,000 more for a total of 30,000 units through 2026. We also want him, as I mentioned, with respect to supportive housing, to accelerate the timeline of his promise to create 15,000 units of supportive housing over the next 15 years. We want that timeline shrunk down to 10 years because we're seeing the vast need. And for the governor, we again recommend that he implement home stability support and also accelerate the production of the 20,000 units of supportive housing that he committed to in 2016. And also notable there that he has only funded the first 6,000 of those units, and so he needs to actually fund the remaining 14,000 units that he promised back then and actually get that moving. We would also like to see some expanded access to supportive housing for adult families, which is a population that we see have a much higher level of disabilities. And then we have a whole slew of recommendations related to shelter processes and conditions, and I'm happy to answer questions about those as needed. But that should pretty much wrap it up, and I can take questions.
What about street protests?
Mm-hmm.
And I think for people that live in New York City, that's the most visible issue that we see every day.
Absolutely, yeah, and so it's so hard to quantify how many folks are on the streets. We do know there's a lot of cycling in back and forth between different systems, folks on the streets and the shelters, criminal justice involvement. One of our main recommendations, I think, for supportive housing is really also targeted for folks on the streets, because a lot of folks on the streets are sort of disproportionately impacted by severe mental illness, substance use issues, and really need that access to housing in order to be able to get off the streets.
So what is your grade for the city on how they handle that? Because a lot of the homeless don't want to come into shelter.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think there are a few policy changes that would need to be put into place. You know, we do talk about in the report the need to increase the number of safe haven beds, which are low threshold shelters that allow folks to at least get up off the streets and into a safe indoor space. Because we know many folks on the streets are averse to entering the shelter system because of the way it's set up. And so we call for an increase there, but also the housing piece is an increase in the availability of supportive housing and shrinking that timeline.
Do you feel like the city is being aggressive enough in helping that and helping to bring
Not with respect to supportive housing. We need to be more aggressive on that. And they have added a significant number of safe haven beds, but in the absence of housing, we've seen people are staying in them longer, and we need more. And so the second piece of that is the housing piece, and that's where we're failing.
Have you sent a copy of your findings to both the governor and the mayor's offices in advance, and if so, what's been the response?
We will send them the full report today. We got some preliminary responses that they think they're doing a great job. You know, we would argue that that's not the case, and we lay it out pretty clearly with the data.
Have they reached out to say, let's meet, let's talk about maybe sending a team of reps to meet with Coalition for the Homeless to see how they can?
The state has not. We generally have somewhat regular meetings with the city, particularly with the Department of Homeless Services, to talk about issues there. But with respect to the housing piece, you know, that's something that we've been advocating for publicly as part of the House Our Future campaign. So we've been doing a lot of aggressive just pushing of the mayor on that, and we don't have any movement there yet. Yes?
What happened with the Homestretch program? It's my understanding that the two projects that came of it were the apartments at Landing Road and Virginia Pike's residence. I'm curious about outcomes and expanded or...
Is that the model that has both shelter and housing? I'm not sure. I think that's still pretty in the early stages of development in terms of whether or not that's a viable option for developing housing moving forward. There are only a few developers that are working on that model of housing, so we don't have great data on that.
Even though it was announced in like 2015?
yeah, still pretty slow going.
We've been listening to members of the Coalition for the Homeless discuss their analysis and report of the homelessness in the city during the year of 2019. The report also takes a decades-long look at where they believe it stems from in the city.